And just so everybody knows, I'm recording the meeting. Okay, now I'm the host.
There we go.
And I would suggest, Richard, uh, that it would be good if you recorded this too.
Uh-huh. See how we do that. Record. Here we go.
This is just a backup.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, good, we're having a nice turnout. As you guys may know, these are weekly conversations that NACUSA-LA started with the COVID-19 lockdown, and we're going to be continuing it because it's fun and informative, and we get great speakers like Richard Derby. And he's going to be presenting on the music of Elliott Carter, something that he is an expert on. He also happens to be our vice president and does wonderful things for the community. He has a lot of material. We have a lot of material to go through. So I'm only going to wait about another minute for people to come in before we start. And I'll continue to admit people, but we're going to just kind of start right off. And then Richard has also asked that we hold our questions. Isn't that correct?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. So there will be a chance to ask questions, but at the end, if that's okay with everybody. Okay, so another few seconds and we'll start. Do you want to start with one of the examples, by the way?
Oh, no, not yet. I've got a big introduction.
Okay, I want to say, first of all, that Richard is vice president of the LA chapter of NACUSA, and we're really happy to have him in that role.
Thank you.
So,
Agreed.
wonderful. And then next week, David Rakelin is going to speak.
That's true. I'm going to speak on the 7 eras of film music.
Cool.
And the following week, I'm going to give a presentation on preserving and digitizing your recordings.
Cool.
And why the changes in copyright law give you new opportunities for using that old audio in lucrative ways.
Okay.
So
perfect.
if anybody's interested in speaking in July, let us know.
Greg, it's awfully loud. Greg! Greg! It's awfully loud.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yes. What I'm going to do is mute everyone except for Richard. And this is so we can move quickly. And hi, Dion. I just briefly announced that Richard has a bunch of material to go through, and he's asked that we hold our questions till the end. But there will be a chance to ask questions. Okay, so I'm going to mute everybody. Then I'm going to unmute Richard. Okay, you can unmute yourself, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Good.
All right, so without further ado, let's hear Professor Richard Derby and the music of Elliott Carter.
Great. As you probably know by now, I'm Richard Derby. Carter was one of the most important composers of the second half of the 20th century. I'd go further. I'd say one of the most important composers of all time. I knew him personally. He wasn't my teacher formally. It was more of an unofficial mentor relationship. I knew from the very earliest years that I was going to be a composer. I was at age 4, I was listening to Beethoven and Richard Strauss and Tchaikovsky, and I just knew I wanted to do that. By the time I was about 11, I was eagerly investigating 20th century music. In high school, I was already experimenting with 12-tone and serial techniques in some of my pieces. So as an undergraduate, I went to University of California, Santa Barbara. And I was interested in advanced music. I was looking at all kinds of advanced composers, radical composers, even avant-garde composers. I'm talking like Xenakis and Ligeti and Lutoslawski and Barrio and so forth. And it was all interesting, but a lot of it seemed gimmicky to me, and it didn't seem like something that you could base a growing language of music on. So it was interesting, but it didn't work. As a graduate student working on my doctorate, I stayed at Santa Barbara, and I started, this is in the mid 1970s, I started looking at Elliott Carter in more depth. I was reading his essays, and I began to realize, he agrees with me. That means he's right. He wasn't afraid to call a spade, or he would say in polite terms, look, the emperor has no clothes. You know, this kind of procedure in the avant-garde is kind of gimmicky. It doesn't really work. I went back to his music and started to take an in-depth look at it, and I realized this stuff is really good. It's expressive, it's logical. He's solving a lot of the problems that we face as composers. Now, as a graduate student, I was teaching composition as well in the undergraduate College of Creative Studies at the university. That's where I was an undergraduate. The philosophy behind creative studies was that advanced students, advanced undergraduates in the arts or even in the sciences shouldn't have to wait until the second half of their senior year to get a composition lesson, right? So they could work throughout their undergraduate degrees in their discipline. So I was teaching composition, and I had about 6 students. Some of you know Jack Van Zandt. He was one of my students up there. And in addition to teaching composition, I put together a class every quarter. We were on the quarter system on topics that I thought would be of interest. We studied the development of the symphony in the 20th century, 12-tone technique, serial technique. And in the spring of 1976, I put together a class on Carter's music. And I mean, we went into depth in the scores. You know, we were analyzing it. It turns out that Carter was in Los Angeles at the same time for a week. That would have been April '76. Hosted at Cal Arts, California Institute of the Arts in Valencia. Monday evening concerts in Los Angeles, performed his landmark double concerto for harpsichord and piano with 2 chamber orchestras. And so my students and I made a field trip, went down for that. Long story short, through the assistance of Thea Musgrave, the Scottish composer who was also teaching in the college at that time, we were able to get Carter to come up to Santa Barbara at the end of the week and give a presentation there. So Thea told me, Richard, don't take your beat up student car, you know, check out a sedan from the university pool, drive down to Valencia, pick him up, bring him up, check him into his hotel, bring him to the faculty club and join us for lunch. I had him in the car for 2 hours. We bonded, we had a great time. We talked about everything, you know. I had 6 or 7 students in my class. We had over 150 people in the lecture. I mean, the music department essentially shut down for Elliott Carter. And it went very well, of course. And a few days later, he wrote me a letter through the college. He said, you're one of the few who really understands my music. I want to keep in touch. Let's keep in touch. And we did over the years. We tried to get together whenever we were in the same city, which wasn't that often. He was a lifelong resident of New York City. He wrote a letter of recommendation for my academic file. In 1977-78, I had a Fulbright fellowship in London, and he wrote me and he said, hey, you're in London. I'm going to be in London for a week. The BBC is putting on a week of celebration for my 70th birthday. Let's get in touch. Here's my phone number. And we met up. In around 1980, 81, he wrote me and said, the scholarly journal Perspectives of New Music wants to publish an article on my music, and I told them I want you to be the one to write it. So I decided to write an analysis of his relatively new duo for violin and piano. There was nothing in the literature at that time. It came out in '82, and he wrote me a big long letter saying, "You nailed it. You did a perfect job. This is great. It's the best article in the whole journal." You know, it goes on and on. Over the years, I suppose I have about 12 letters from him. In and I should say, many years later now, as I meet some of these younger Carter scholars from a younger generation, without fail, they say, "OMG, you're Richard Derby. I grew up on that article. That article helped decide my career," you know. So in 1990, the Ojai Festival focused on Carter, and so he came out for that. I saw him there. 1991, 92, Southwest Chamber Music, Pasadena-based group, was playing a lot of Carter, and they had him out for a 6-week residency. They got the Getty Center to put him up, and so we had a great time. Without my knowledge, he approached Southwest Chamber Music and said, "You need to play Richard's music." And so over a decade, that resulted in their performing 5 of my pieces. 4 of them were new commissions, and ultimately a CD released by Cambria Master Recordings in 2000. So I owe a lot to Carter. He was a very generous man. He, like me, was always interested in advanced music from the start. He was interested in some of the advanced things that were going on in the early part of the 20th century. Of all things, as a boy, he was in the audience at the first New York City performance of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, if you can believe that. He got his bachelor's degree from Harvard University, and he took up Walter Piston's recommendation to go to France to study with Nadia Boulanger. Boulanger, of course, was the composition teacher who taught so many of the American composers and who was a staunch advocate of Stravinsky's neoclassicism. So this is in the 1930s. Now, many years later, Carter wrote that many artists and composers in the 1930s felt that because of the social crisis that was the Depression, and then later World War II, that artists and composers should write works that were approachable, that would support the masses. So Carter agreed with that, and he wrote accessible pieces in the 1930s. They're diatonic, they're neoclassic, 1930s, early 1940s. And David will prepare, we're going to listen to the beginning of the finale of the Symphony Number 1 from 1942, it'd be the 3rd movement. He called it Symphony Number 1, and he never wrote another numbered symphony. We'll hear that. We'll hear how approachable and fun it is.
Okay, so do you want me to play the first audio example?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
So that's fun. That's easy to listen to.
Oh, hold on just a second. I just want to confirm, can everyone raise their hand if they heard that? Okay, good. Thank you. Continue, Richard.
Yeah. So it's kind of catchy. It's got a little jazzy syncopation to it. Not particularly challenging. I mean, it's easy to listen to. It's fun. It's accomplished. You know, it's very skilled writing. And it's not something that you would say, oh, that's going to change the course of music history. You know, but Carter didn't continue to write in this vein. After World War II ended, the arts took off again, especially in Europe, including the avant-garde and the more advanced advocates. In Germany, you had the Donau-Eschingen festivals and the Darmstadt School. This is where the total serialists held forth. I'm talking Stockhausen and Boulez, and independently in the United States, you had Milton Babbitt writing total serialism. The total serialists took Schoenberg's idea of taking the 12 pitches in an atonal context and putting them in a specific order, calling it the tone row or the series, and basing your music on this constantly cycling order of pitches. And you can flip them upside down, inverted, or play them backwards, retrograde. And the total serialist said, huh, we can use other aspects of music and build series out of them too, like different durations, you know, different rhythms, and just rotate those around. And dynamics, different levels of volume, and rotate those around. So you had all these formulas that were generating the stuff that paradoxically sounds rather random. These are the pieces that go, boop, you know. Carter was interested in re-examining his interest in advanced music, but he wanted to do it in a way that was responsible, that was more the way music communicates with listeners. And he took several years to think this through, rather than just jumping into things. He was interested and curious about all of the developments, but in particular never bought into serialism. Despite what you will read in some articles, Carter never wrote serial music. He never used a tone row. He didn't think that was a good, he wasn't interested in a system that would crank out content. He thought it was mechanical. And he says explicitly, that's not the way people do music. We don't track pitches in a row. And especially when they're moving around and jumping around from range, or flipping upside down or playing backwards. Well, so then the next logical question is, well, if that isn't how we listen to music, how do we listen to music? What is it that people hear? It dawned on Carter at one point that they hear intervals. They respond to the sound of intervals, the distance between two notes. Now, even untrained people that aren't trained musicians, recognize the difference, for instance, between a major third, happy, and minor third, sad. I had a college roommate once who was not a music major. One summer, he came to me and he says, what's going on in this Brahms concerto right here? The mood changes and it's very effective, but how does he get that? And I listened. I said, oh, he's changing from the major mode to the minor mode. He says, what's that? He had no idea what I was talking about, but it was effective. It communicated with him. Tritones. Oh, tritone, unstable, anxious. Perfect fifth is either restful or sometimes, depending on the context, military, right? Dun, da, da. March like a minor second or a major seventh. Tense. These are associations that have grown up over the centuries, and it occurred to Carter, why not use this to express the kind of emotions that we're trying to express in music? It's like a gift horse. So he thought long and hard about, he realized there had been many stylistic advances in the first half of the 20th century already that maybe didn't need to be revisited. Stravinsky, for instance, certainly freed up our sense of rhythm. We're no longer needing to write things in symmetrical 4/4 phrases like da 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 bum 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 bum. With Stravinsky, we've got odd number beats to the measure, maybe 5 beats to a measure, or 11/16 or something, and constantly changing. So in the Rite of Spring, you've got dun 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 bum 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 bum, freed up our sense of rhythm. With things like polytonality, more than one key at a time, or later on with Schoenberg and the whole idea of atonal music, we certainly freed up our sense of pitch. And with the tone row, one possible way of organizing it, everybody and their dog was inventing new kinds of sounds, either inventing actual new instruments like an electronic instrument, or more often new ways of playing old instruments, like rapping on with your knuckles on the cello, or reaching under the cover of the piano to play on the strings, directly on the strings, often to rather gimmicky effect. You know, if that's the only thing you've got going in your piece, ooh, my piece goes blat, you know, or honk, you know. I mean, you still need pitches and rhythms that make sense, that express something, and are put together in a logical way. But Carter realized that there was one area that nobody seemed to be paying much attention to, and that was the way musical ideas connect with each other. And I'm going to quote from one of his essays. He says, there was a lot of first you do this for a while, then you do that, end quote. What I would call structural form. You know, you have an A section, and then maybe you go to a B section, and then you go back to an A section, and maybe you go to a C section. Two-dimensional, everything in a row. Carter, back to his quote, he says, I wanted to mix up the this and the that to find ways of connecting musical ideas other than by linear succession, end quote. That's a very important point. Remember that, that's going to come up. It was somewhat related topic. He thought deeply about how we experience musical time, the way we experience the flow of time in music. He was doing a lot of reading in philosophers for some reason. And apparently philosophers, that's one thing they think about a lot, is how we experience time. Carter came up with for his purposes, two basic ways. One he calls clock time. And that's simply to measure the passing of time in a systematic, even pulse. You might be 60 seconds per minute. It might be some other speed, but you're ticking it away, measuring it in a scientific manner. But most of the time, that's not how we as human beings experience the events in our lives. If we're happy, we're with friends, we're eating and drinking, we say, man, the time went by fast. Or if we're grieving the loss of somebody to COVID-19, or we're bored to tears with our social isolation, or we're in pain, we're physical pain, we say the time is going slowly. Well, the time isn't going faster or slower, it's still ticking away in terms of clock time, but the way we perceive it is different. Carter calls that psychological time. You could call it musical time. And he's interested, he decided he wanted to explore both types of time in his music. There's one more insight he had. He decided it might be advantageous to try to write music that's sensitive to the actual sound producing characteristics of the instruments themselves. And the most obvious example is the piano. It bothered him that 19th century Romantic composers tended to write the same content for the piano that they were writing for strings. And I think in one of his essays, he actually mentions the Robert Schumann piano quintet. He says, it's playing the same melody, these lyric lines. Now, the thing about a string instrument is that you can change the nature of the tone while it's being produced. You can increase the volume, you can decrease the volume, you can increase or decrease the amount of vibrato. To a certain extent, you can do that with wind instruments too. Can't do that on a piano. You strike the note on the piano and that's it. You can cut it short by lifting the key or the pedal. And, you know, essentially the piano is a percussion instrument, or more accurately, it's a combination percussion string instrument. The hammer strikes the string. And the Romantic composers weren't really acknowledging that. So we say that a pianist has a delicate touch. Oh, she has a very sensitive touch. We value that, and that it is a valuable thing. But what we're really saying is that she's able to emulate, to sort of fake a lyric line by slow, very small gradations of volume between the notes. Carter is saying, maybe we should pay attention to how this instrument is making it sound and write accordingly, and not just try to pretend that everything's the same. So he's got all these ideas that he's been knocking around for several years. In 1948, he was commissioned to write a sonata for cello and piano. And he wrote 3 neoclassical movements. And then he thought, you know, it needs another movement that became the first movement. And he pushed the other movements out in back of it. And it's in this movement where he begins to develop his new mature style. Let's take a look at the example 1 document. It's the first page of the score.
Okay. Hopefully everyone is seeing this.
It looks good. So what's the piano doing, especially after the first couple of bars? You see, it's playing staccato notes on every beat. Quarter note, quarter note, quarter note, quarter note. So clock time, right? And arguably, this might be a way of writing for the piano that's a little more sympathetic with its semi-percussive nature. Now take a look at what the cello's playing down in the second system. Very different. Long held notes, every duration is different. There's crescendos while it's being played and decrescendos. And it says cantabile, as if singing. And a very important expression note, it says expressivo quasi rubato, expressive and quasi, or as if, robbed, or in other words, freely. Now the word quasi is very important because Carter doesn't want him to actually play it freely. He needs the performer to pay strict attention to these notated durations, because that's how the instruments coordinate with each other. That's how he preserves the harmonic progression that the overlap of these instruments is producing. That's a very, harmonic progression is very important to Carter. But the performer needs to realize that the effect is as if it's spontaneous, psychological time. I made the mistake. I actually confronted Carter. I said, how can you write rubato when the notation is so specific? He says, no, 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 Richard, quasi rubato. And I got it. Ah, as if it's being spontaneously presented, as if it's being improvised. So what we see here is 2 different kinds of music going on at the same time. David, we can listen to the audio example. Try to hear what's going on.
We're switching to audio.
Mm-hmm. Now they're still, it's tentative. They're still sort of playing together. They get louder at the same time. They're still sort of forming the same gesture together. But this is Carter beginning to explore some of these ideas he has about independent strands of thought in the music. In 1950, Carter received a Guggenheim grant And he decided he wanted to write a piece that would finally explore all of these advanced ideas that he was having, in his words, to get it out of his system. And he thought the best way to do that would be to leave his routine in New York City. He took his wife, they went to a house in the desert outside of Tucson. And there in 1950 and in 1951, 51 being the year I was born, he wrote an uncommissioned first string quartet to try to work out these ideas. It's a landmark piece. It's a big piece. It's almost 40 minutes long, 38 or 39 minutes. And it's about change. The movements transition gradually out from one to another. Now, Carter realized in a piece that's this long, you kind of need, but it didn't make sense to put the breaks where you usually have them, which is between movements, because the movements are emerging, transforming out of each other. So he has the radical idea of putting the breaks in the middle of the movement. So the second movement, scherzo, emerges slowly from the first movement, and they plays for a while, and then it just stops. There's a double bar line, and the players turn the page, and they adjust their music stand, and they scratch themselves, you know, whatever they do. Hopefully they don't tune up. And then they start playing the second movement again. And it actually backtracks by about a page. Now, he doesn't say go back a page, he writes it out. And it's not literal. There are some changes in the notes, but it's about 80 to 85% the same. So what he's doing is it's as if he's saying to the listener, okay, we're getting back on track and feeding into where we were so that we can continue the movement. The third movement, he divides the players into two duos. It starts with the lower instruments, the viola and the cello, playing a very dramatic kind of music. Psychological time, rather jagged rhythms, and then they stop playing, and then the two violins play very high in the range, very still, very quiet, kind of starry night music. And it's not strictly clock time, but it's the rhythms are much more even than what the viola and the cello are playing. So we've got these two different kinds of music, and at first they alternate. And then they start to overlap. The violins are still playing their high notes. And the cello and viola interrupt and start playing their more dramatic music down the bottom. The violins gradually start dropping in range toward the middle, and the cello and the viola come up and join them in the middle, but they continue to play these two very different kinds of music at the same time. The fourth movement is a set of variations. But unlike a traditional variation, which has one melody that gets varied, he's got several different musical ideas that are alternating and get varied. And every time one of these ideas comes back, it's a little bit faster than before. So some of the ideas start out rather fast. So they actually, in the middle of the movement, they actually reach a point where they get too fast and they disappear from the movement. And the ideas that were slower keep going as they speed up. It's a little bit like driving on the freeway. The guy who's going 85 disappears on the horizon, and then there's grandma on the slow lane next to you, right? Fascinating piece. David's already got the first two pages up on the string quartet. It starts with a cello solo, and you can see it's kind of jagged rhythms. There's actually separate musical ideas, 3 or 4 separate musical ideas separated by brief rests. What he's actually doing, it turns out, is forecasting most of the major ideas to come in the quartet. So he forecasts there in bars 3 and 4, he forecasts the slow movement and so forth. Psychological time, right? So down, at least most of the time, down in the last bar at the bottom of the page, the second violin comes in playing pizzicato, a more mechanical kind of sound, and he's playing clock time. He's playing in a fixed series of notes, but it's faster than the prevailing beat. It's every 3rd 16th note, dotted 8th, 16th tied to 8th, 8th tied to 16th, dotted 8th. So he's traveling at a faster rate than the prevailing beat in the cello. Now we'll move over to the next page, and you can see the cello continues to play while the violin's playing his pizzicato clock time. And the cello starts playing faster. He plays quintuplets, 5/16 for a beat. Ba, 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 ba. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now we come up on one of the things that Carter is best known for, the metric modulation. Carter preferred the term tempo modulation. It's a more precise description of what's going on, but somebody wrote an article and called it metric modulation and the term stuck. In my definition, it's a change of speed according to a strict ratio between note values. Now, this is not a new idea. If you think back in classical music, you see the term doppio movimento, which means double speed, twice as fast. That's a metric modulation. It's a very simple ratio, 1 to 2, right? Quarter note becomes a half note, maybe. As a graduate student, I was studying a score by Jan Sibelius, the early 20th century Finnish composer. And I think it was the Third Symphony. Toward the end, I was surprised to see that the brass were playing in half note triplets. And then there was a change in tempo. And the meter changed to 3/2, and they were playing in regular half notes. And I thought, OMG, there's a metric modulation in Sibelius. And it's a slightly more complicated ratio. It's 2 to 3, right? The triplet becomes the regular half note. What Carter does is he uses it far more frequently, and he uses far more complex ratios than used to be used. So up at the top, you'll see he says the quarter note in the preceding bar is equal to dotted eighth tied to an eighth. Another way of writing that would simply have been to say, okay, the cello's 16th note quintuplets become equivalent to the regular 16th note in the following bar. And look, he makes it easy. He says that the time signature is 10/16. So we're still actually thinking in groups of 5. That's one thing about Carter. He tries to, sometimes he has complex things that he's doing, but he tries to make the notation as clear as possible and as easy as possible for the performer. And I've heard performers say over and over again, actually, Carter is quite kind the way he's notating things, as compared to some of these composers who invent all kinds of radical notations and you don't know what it is you're supposed to play, right? So the cello keeps playing in his groups of 5, only they're rewritten as regular 16ths. Da, 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 da. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then the time signature changes to 6/16. So now we're in compound meter, and we're grouping them in 3. Dot, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, which means now he can add a dot to it. Dun, 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 dun. Which, by the way, is one of the reasons for having a metric modulation in the first place. You can introduce subdivisions of the beat that would be so difficult to notate in the old tempo. If you tried to write 2 in the time of 3 quintuplets, but here you can write it. Dotted 16ths, da 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 dun 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 dun. And then the bottom of the page, it goes from dotted 16ths to dotted 8ths, twice as slow. Dun 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 dun. And there's another metric modulation. And the dotted 8th becomes the new quarter note. Again, he's trying to make it simple. Okay, we're now traveling in this new speed. Well, let's make it the new beat. Let's make it easy, quarter note. And the cello keeps playing that so that the performers can get a handle on the new speed. One other way that Carter, by the way, makes it easy is that he always puts a double bar line at a metric modulation. So you see a double bar line, you go, oh, the tempo is changing. So you can now see the metronome mark is 120 per minute, which is considerably faster than the 72 per minute on page 1. Now, look at the second violin. Comes back with his pizzicato clock time, but he's playing longer notes. It's quarter note tied to 16th. It's every 5th 16th note. Quarter tied to 16th, dotted 8th tied to 8th, 8th tied to dotted 8th, 16th tied to quarter. He's still playing clock time. But the tempo's faster, isn't it? Do you see what he's done? If you do the math, every 5th 16th note at the new tempo of 120 at the bottom of the page is exactly equivalent in real time to the listener's ear as every 3rd 16th note at the bottom of page 1 in the slower tempo. To the listener, the second violin spizzicato hasn't changed speed at all, and the cello has. Carter has found a way to let one part of the music change speed while the other part remains fixed. People, this blows the lid off musical form. We can now overlap movements. Movements can weave in and out of each other. We can flash forward. We can have flashbacks, rather like a movie. We can flashback in a movie, especially if it's a split screen. He's added a dimension to the sense of time. It's no longer just two-dimensional. We can now overlap the this and the that. Let's, David, let's listen to it, see if we can hear that. Incredible music. Another analogy I like to make is this, it's roughly comparable to the stream of consciousness effect in literature by authors like James Joyce or Virginia Woolf, where their characters are, their thoughts are scattered, they're maybe projecting into the future, they're thinking back, you know, it's roughly similar to what was going on in literature. Now, Carter was aware that this quartet, he might never hear this quartet, it was uncommissioned. And it, in fact, took him a while. He sent it to a lot of different quartets. And finally, the string quartet, the Walden Quartet at the University of Illinois, decided to rehearse it and play it. Eventually, over a period of 3 or 4 years, it was performed more than any of his other pieces, was performed internationally and gained him an international reputation. So he was encouraged and said, I'm going to continue. He wrote a couple of very interesting pieces in the 1950s, which we don't have time to look at. And in 1959, the Juilliard String Quartet commissioned the Second String Quartet. Written in 1959, performed in 1960, won the Pulitzer Prize in 1960, won the New York Music Critics Circle Award in 1960. 1961, it won a UNESCO Prize in Europe. With this piece, we arrive at the fully mature Carter advanced style. It's much shorter than the first quartet. It's about 20 minutes long. It's played continuously, no breaks. And the thing that stands out about this quartet is that he assigns each instrument its own expressive character or personality. One Carter scholar says it's almost like watching actors on a stage play portraying these different personalities. So in the first violin, he makes him kind of brash, flashy, bold, self-centered, a show-off, struts around. Remind you of anybody right now? Maybe. Second violin is sort of compulsive, obsessive compulsive. He playing steady, regular beats, clock time throughout. He's trying to hold everything together. it's actually the same pulse throughout the entire quartet. It's at 70 per minute, or it's double, 140. And of course, there are metric modulations throughout the quartet. So that 70 per minute has to be notated into whatever beat subdivision will give you that, rather like we saw in the second violin at the beginning of the first quartet. One Elliott Carter scholar says he's almost inclined to say this particular personality is Carter himself. He's trying to, it's the composer trying to control the flow of his own music. Viola is sort of morose, melancholy.
Yes, now I see them. Sorry, I have admitted them now. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Okay, David had a call. The viola is melancholy, brooding, sad, a little depressed. The fact that the viola's range is low, a little bit lower than the violin, might help with this. So again, Carter's paying attention to the sound producing characteristic of the instrument. The cello always speeds up and slows down. And of course, the others aren't participating in this cello rondo or ritardando, so it has to be written into the durations. Might be as simple as 1/16 note shorter each time, or a triplet eighth shorter, or a combination of triplet eighths and sixteenths. Sometimes it's not precise. It's not a steady cello rondo. It's uneven. But again, as we saw in the cello in the cello sonata, the player needs to observe the written durations in order to remain coordinated with the other instruments and preserve the flow of the harmonies, but playing it as if it's spontaneous, as if it's being improvised at the moment. Carter tends, you can see it at the top there, Carter tends to try to make it easier on the performer by using a dotted or a dashed slur with an arrow point at the end. Okay, so that's the effect of play it as if it's an accelerando. I'm going to take a break for a moment and talk about a discussion I had with Carter during the drive up to Santa Barbara on aleatoric notation and improvisation. I told him, you know, it seemed to me that a lot of this chance notation, aleatoric notation, was sort of gimmicky and didn't really work. But I thought that Ludosławski, the Polish composer, did something that might be a more cautious and a more responsible way of introducing a little bit of freedom in the score. And I knew he'd know what I was talking about. What Ludosławski does is, in some sections, the conductor stops beating the beat and just gives a cue to show that the section starts, and then in his head, he counts down a number of seconds. And each individual instrument has carefully notated pitches and durations of a short phrase, a 2 or 3 beats maybe, that repeat. And until the section ends, they keep repeating. And the length of the different phrases is different, so the overlaps are a little bit different. And so I told Carter, that seems to me like that might be a more responsible way of trying to introduce a little bit of freedom to your score. Carter said, no, I disagree. He said, and the thing that I disagree with most in those sections in Ludosławski is that in so doing that, he relinquishes harmonic control. And I thought, you know, you're absolutely right, son of a gun. Because paradoxically, those sections in Ludosławski have the effect of sounding rather static. It's like the music gets stuck, the same notes just sort of rotating around. Carter says, the harmonic flow is very important to me. He went on to talk about composers who ask for actual improvisation in their scores. He says, in my experience, if you ask a performer to improvise, they tend to play what they're familiar with, which in the case of a classically trained musician is likely to be 19th century Romanticism, which is probably not what you had in mind for your 20th century piece. He talked about he described a Stockhausen piece where Stockhausen calls for improvisation, and then he went to the rehearsal and he was unhappy with it. He said, no, no, don't play that. Play it more like this. And he kept stopping them, and he kept saying, no, no, play it more like this, until he more or less told them exactly what to play. Carter's point, if you're going to wind up telling them exactly what to play, write it down in the first place. Don't go through this charade of, oh, we're improvising. Carter said, composing is what we do. Performers perform, listeners listen, and we as composers have the responsibility, hopefully, to invent something that's interesting, something that is compelling, something that moves forward, something that sounds as if it's being spontaneously improvised. That's our job. Let's do our job as composers. Back to the string quartet. There's another important thing that he does to help characterize these separate personalities that are going on in the separate instruments. He assigns individual intervals to each instrument. The first violin gets a minor third, and the perfect fifth, and none of the other instruments use those intervals. Now, perhaps the perfect fifth helps express the dramatic attention-getting character of the first violin, dun dun dun, you know. Second violin gets the major third, major sixth, and sometimes the major seventh. The viola gets minor seventh and a tritone. Now, especially the tritone, the minor seventh, but especially the tritone might help with the characterization of the sad, melancholy personality. The cello gets the perfect fourth, and the minor sixth. All four instruments share the minor second and the major second. Half steps and whole steps are the glue that hold this music together. Here's the dramatic plan. There are 4 movements played without a pause, plus an introduction. As you can see, the introduction is kind of where they introduce their personalities. And then there's a conclusion at the end. He calls it a conclusion, not an epilogue. Excuse me. The conclusion, they sort of go back to their identities, and it ends quietly with the second violin playing his clock time, and it just stops. It's almost as if, one Carter scholar says, it's almost as if these players are still out there. We just stopped listening in on what they're talking about. Carter's pieces often, not always, but often end quietly, which is interesting. With each successive movement, the plan is that the amount of cooperation among the instruments increases. So by the time we get to the third slow movement, they're pretty much working together to build a melodic slow movement. But there are cadenzas in between the movements. And atypically, unlike a usual cadenza in a classical concerto where the soloist plays by herself and shows off, in the first 2 cadenzas here, they're accompanied. So the other instruments are accompanying, and sort of the opposite happens in these cadenzas. The movements are getting more and more cooperative in each successive cadenza. They become less and less cooperative and more resistant to each other. So by the time we get to the cello's cadenza in between the second and third movement, he's speeding up and slowing down like to beat the band. And the other 3 are saying, they're not having any of this. They start playing clock time. They're resisting his ridiculous rushing around. Now, they don't necessarily play the second violins 70 per minute. They've got their own speed going, but they're all ticking away like metronomes, resisting the cello. By the time we get to the first violin's cadenza, between the third and fourth movement, they're so mad that they just shut up. They don't play. It's unaccompanied. And he struts around, he shows off for a minute, and then he stops and he borrows the viola's tritone, this is ascending tritone, as if he's saying, are you there? Where are you? 2 bars of stony silence follow. No response. He mutters his perfect fifth to himself, keeps playing, and then he borrows one of the cello's intervals, no response. And then he starts showing off, he's playing his cadenza, and the other 3 instruments come in, but it's not to accompany him. They start the 4th movement without him. We've had enough of this. We're going on with the rest of the quartet. And he's desperately trying to finish his cadenza. This is fascinating stuff. It is just, if you know the secret, if you know what's going on in the piece, it is thrilling to listen to these guys argue and discuss and make up and get back together again. It's just stunning. Now we're taking a look at the score. Cello starts with a descending pattern of perfect fourths, and you can see it's sort of written into the duration of an accelerando. Quarter note tied to an eighth note triplet, which is 1.33 beats. Quarter note triplet tied to an eighth note, which is 1.16 beats. A regular eighth note, which is 0.5, and then 2 16th notes, 0.25 beats. So it's an approximate accelerando. Sounds like this. Then the first violin responds with his minor thirds. And they start talking, they start introducing themselves. Now let's take a look at the top of page 2, bars 12 through 15. The viola comes up with an arch phrase in tritones, her interval. It starts with the B natural at the bottom, and then the high note is C sharp. So it sounds like this. The cello responds with a similar arch phrase, the same low note, the same beginning note, B natural, the same high note, D flat, but uses his perfect fourths and a falling minor sixth at the end, and he accelerates. So it sounds like this. Then the first violin responds with his perfect fifth, the same high note. You see what they're doing? They're talking together. They're discussing a similar idea, but with retaining their own individual personality. This little phrase in a nutshell is kind of how the whole piece works. And David, let's take a listen to it. Wow. Now, we've talked a lot about rhythmic devices and interval assignment, but there's more going on than just intervals in this music. The next logical question to Carter, once he's decided to use intervals, well, which chords contain those intervals? Which three-note chords have the intervals in them that I want to use? Which four-note chords have the three-note chords that I want to use? So over the years, he started to compile a list of all these chords. He called it his harmony book. He had no intention of publishing it. It was just a personal resource. But in 2002, his student, John Link, got permission to edit and publish the book along with Nicholas Hopkins, the Elliott Carter Harmony Book. It's still available through Carl Fisher, hardback or paperback. It's the most useful resource imaginable for a composer. You have all the possible harmonic combinations just laid out, and you can use them any way you want. You know, it's just information there. Let's see. Chord, by the way, is just a term. You can also use it melodically. I'm just talking about a collection of notes and what properties they have. And this is not a compositional system like the 12-tone row. These are just resources that you can use any way you want. You can decide to base a movement or a section on a particular chord or several chords, or intuition is you're free to shape it any way you want, but you have resources at your fingertips. Intuition is important to Carter. I once heard him say in a question and answer session at USC at the Schoenberg Institute that somebody asked him, how do you pick which notes you play, you write? And I imagine the questioner was expecting him to talk about something like this, he's picking his chords from this chart. Instead, Carter says, he thought about it, and he says, good voice leading. And I thought, wow, yeah, good voice leading still applies in an atonal context. He said that's one of the most important considerations when he's connecting chords. Now, other theorists have come up with this same content. I think Carter's the only composer who's done it, but especially Alan Fort has published his book, The Structure of Atonal Music. It's exact same content. It's the same chords. They're in a different order, and he gives them a different name than Carter's. But these are simply musical facts about how many of these chords there are and what their properties are. So we'll take a look at them. You notice he's using staff notation. Treble clef is assumed. It makes it easy to read. And by the way, the convention is to write them in as compact a form as possible, which usually means the smallest intervals are on the bottom. That's not necessarily how you need to use it in your composition. You can spread those notes out any way you want, but it's just easy to write it in compact form. Now, you can see there's also numbers, digital numbers down at the bottom. Shortcut for naming these chords. It always starts with 0, which refers to the starting note. And then the remaining numbers simply count the number of half steps above it the next note is. So you take a look at that first 3-note chord, 0, 4, 8. So 4 is 4 half steps, that's a major third. Another 4 half steps above that, 4 to 8, another major third. That's the augmented triad. Now, an augmented triad is still an augmented triad, whether you play it in root position or you invert it. Or you transpose it. Take a look at the next chord, 0, 3, 6, 2 minor thirds. That's the diminished triad, which is still a diminished triad. If you invert it, you get major 6 out of it. Excuse me. Let's take a look at the 5th chord, 0, 2, 7, C, D, and G. Major 2nd and perfect 4th. Let's move the middle note up an octave. I get 2 perfect 5ths. I like to call this chord the cycle of 5ths chord. If you invert it, you get perfect 4ths. Same notes. Let's see, chord number 4, 0, 1, 2, that's the cluster. Or. Now, take a look at chord number 6, 0, 3, 7. Minor third on the bottom, major third on the top. That's the minor triad. And by the way, there's only 12 of these 3-note chords. That doesn't seem like many, but the musical fact is, the scientific fact is that any 3-note combination is going to be one of these chords. It all boils down to this. Now, I don't see a major triad anywhere in this chart. Let's try inverting it. Let's go down a minor third from the E, we get C sharp. Let's go down a major third from the C sharp, we get A. There's my major triad. The major triad is the inversion of the minor triad, and vice versa. In terms of the interval content, they're the same chord, or different forms of the same chord. Now I can hear everybody saying, no, they're separate chords. And I agree, in tonal music, they're used very differently. But in mathematical scientific terms, they're simply different forms of the same chord. Take a look at the 4-note chords at the bottom. There's a lot more of those. There's 29 of them. And 2 of them have asterisks by them, number 18 and number 23. Those are the only 2 4-note chords that happen to contain all 11 intervals. Those are the so-called all interval tetrachords, or AIT for short. This is very important to somebody like Carter, who, after all, is using intervals. So if he has a 4-note chord where he can get any interval he needs out of it, that's important. And in fact, it turns out that the first string quartet is actually based on the first one of these, chord number 18. By the time he wrote the second string quartet, he had discovered the second one of these chords. And so the second string quartet is based on both of these all interval trichords. You see how his music is built. He's using these chords as a kind of a source, a background source for the motifs, the phrases, the harmonies, the melodies that he's using. Not unlike in tonal music, we use the major scale or the minor scale as a source for our melodies, etc. It's just that Carter's now expanded. He's expanded his language to include all manner of chords. Let's take a look at the next page, David. We'll look at the 5-note chords. There's more of them. There's 30. How many of them are there? 38 of them. Yeah, 38 5-note chords. And then you get, at the bottom of the page, you get the beginning of the 6-note chord list. Feast your eyes now, David. Can we move on to the next page already? We'll get the rest of the 6-note chords. In the first part of the book, he breaks these chords out and shows all of their subchords. So he has an entire page with just one of the 6-note chords, and then he shows precisely how many 3-note chords are inside it, and how many 4-note chords, and how many 5-note chords, etc. But what we're looking at now is like the appendix in the book, which simply lists them all. Now, we'll see an asterisk by number 35 there. That's the only one of the 50 6-note chords. There are 50 6-note chords, quite a few. 35 is the only one that happens to contain all 12 of the 3-note chords inside of it. You can get any one of the 3-note chords out of that. That's an important bit of information for somebody like Carter. And in fact, he used that chord a lot to base his pieces on, especially towards the end of his life. Carter died in November 2012 at the age of 103 and 11 months. He, his last piece was finished about 5 weeks before he died. I was driving home from work in Anaheim. I turned on KUSC and they were playing Carter's Elegy from the 1930s. And I said, uh-oh, I know what happened. I wrote a cello solo, which I called Tribute, in tribute to Carter. It was actually played at a NACUSA-LA concert at Dion's house in Culver City about 5 years ago. Maggie Parkins on cello. And I based that piece on this all trichord hexachord, or the ATH for short, in tribute to my friend Elliott. So let me ask a trick question. How many can you use chords with more than 6 notes? Well, sure. You know, if you have 7-note chord, it's simply going to be the notes left over from one of the 5-note chords, the complement. And 8-note chord is going to be what's left over from one of the 4-note chords. So in the first part of the book, he lists them all and shows their makeup, their subchords. Let me ask you the trick question. How many 12-note chords are there? Well, in terms of pitches, there's just one. It's the chord with all 12 pitches. But how are those pitches organized? In other words, which intervals do they form? There are many of those, and there's a particular kind that is of interest to Carter. Can you guess? It would be an all-interval 12-note chord. Not only do you have all 12 pitches, but you have all 11 intervals in it. And there's a lot of them, and they're all listed in the front of the book. There's a particular couple of types that are of particular interest. One's called symmetrically inverted. So that means the whatever the bottom interval is at the very bottom, the inversion of it is at the very top, and so forth. The second one is inverted by the second one down from the top. One property of these is the tritone is always the middle interval. Kind of makes sense because if you invert a tritone and you get another tritone, it's the interval that equally divides the octave. Another type of all interval chord is the parallel inverted. What that means is whatever interval is on the bottom of the bottom half of the chord, its inversion is on the bottom of the top half, on top of that central tritone. So they invert on up each half instead of top down from the middle. There's yet another kind of all interval 12-note chord. It's one that contains in contiguous form, somewhere with adjacent notes all next to each other, somewhere in this all interval 12-note chord, it contains the all trichord hexachord, this number 6, the number 35. That's of interest to Carter. Carter uses these all interval chords. His piano piece, a solo called Night Fantasies from the early 1980s, uses 88 of them, the same number of keys there are in a piano. And they change every few seconds. So what he does is he's composed the background of his piece and he overlays whatever he's doing with motifs and melodies and so forth on top of these specific locations for individual pitches derived from the all interval 12-note chord. In his Concerto for Orchestra from 1969, he uses one single all interval 12-note chord as a point of reference or almost as a tonic. It's always at the same transposition, so they kind of come back to it at a reference. At his talk in Santa Barbara, Carter showed us that chord on the overhead projector. And he said, notice something about it. He says, notice that the perfect fifth is at the very top. And the major third is near the top. He said, the bottom interval is the minor seventh. He said, I did that on purpose because in traditional music, it's the other way around. And you could hear gasps of awe in the audience. Oh my God. What he means is in tonal music, the fifth is down of a triad is down towards the bottom. And if you got a seventh, it's usually up at the top. He wanted to mix that up, wanted to flip it around just for fun to see what would happen. This Concerto for Orchestra of 1969 has 4 movements. Each one is based on its own 5-note chord. It gives it its own musical identity, its own character, if you will, unified harmonic melodic sound. And what happens in these moments when the orchestra coalesces on this all interval 12-note chord is that somewhere in the middle of it, they pull 5 contiguous notes out and it becomes the 5-note chord for the next movement. So he extracts the movement out of this point of reference chord. Now there are other ways that he characterizes these movements. The second movement, scherzo, is only played in the highest instruments. We're talking mostly flutes and violins. The third movement is dramatic, it's dark, it's in the lowest instruments, basses, cellos, bassoons, trombone, or tuba and timpani. The other 2 movements are like medium high range and medium low range. Now here's the catch. All 4 movements are weaving in and out of each other throughout the entire concerto. See where he's going with this? So he's trying to make it as clear as he can how they differ. They have different harmonies, they have different ranges, they play a different kind of character, but they're weaving in and out of each other, they're interrupting each other. Sometimes 2 of them are playing at the same time, sometimes 3. The moments when all 4 collide tend to be when this all interval 12-note chord comes in again. There's other ways he distinguishes them. The second movement, scherzo, when it makes an appearance toward the beginning of the piece, starts out very fast, and every time it comes back, it gets progressively a little bit slower. So by the end, when it makes an appearance towards the end of the concerto, it's very slow indeed. The fourth movement does the opposite. When it appears towards the beginning, it's very slow, and every time it comes back, it's a little bit faster, until by the time you get to its area of predominance, he calls these the fourth movement because it predominates towards the last quarter of the concerto. By the time you get there, it's picking up speed, and that kind of makes sense because what he's doing is drawing you forward towards the climax of the whole concerto. He's pulling you together to, in most Carter pieces, there's almost every one, there's some moment where you just know this is the climax. This is where it all comes together. In the second string quartet, it's when in the fourth movement, the other instruments finally acquiesce to the cello and they all start playing accelerandos as well. And you get this overlap of accelerandos and it's like going over the falls. One Carter scholar says it's like going over a waterfall, just complete out of control. And you know, you've reached the climax of the piece. I'm going to try to wrap up here. I do want to mention very briefly, there's another thing that he does in the Concerto for Orchestra that's very interesting. It annoys him that you've got all these strings playing in groups. He says, why are we doing that? Well, we do that because back in the classical period, we were writing triads and seventh chords. They were used to playing, chords, and the strings became the sonic glue that kind of held the orchestra together. He says, I'm not writing music like that anymore. I've got the things going on. So he heavily subdivides the strings in the Concerto for Orchestra, sometimes even going so far as to write individual parts for each individual instrument, more like chamber music. I heard Boulez conduct the concerto in 1975, the LA Philharmonic. Met Carter the next year and he asked me, how did it go? He said, it sounded good to me. He says, I would have been there, but nobody tells me about these things until it's too late. So we were sitting there early and the staff was coming out putting the music on the stands, and they were very careful to put just the right part on each string stand because you had to have part number 3 for music stand number 3 in the cellos because they had their own individual. In later scores, Carter doesn't do that as much. He doesn't subdivide as much, and I think it was a practical concern because it added so much to the rehearsal time, and rehearsal time is money, that it become a detriment to programming the Concerto for Orchestra. And Carter was nothing if not practical. He said, okay, I tried it, would back off from it. Now, in conclusion, in some circles, Carter is said to be cerebral or theoretical or intellectual or technical or rule-based or even academic, waving aside for the moment that he never actually taught in university or college. He did teach private composition lessons at Juilliard for a while, even though he told me he didn't want to. The implication in all these criticisms is that the musical resorts are boring, dry, inexpressive. Why would you want to listen to this stuff? It's just playing with these theoretical ideas. I mean, nothing could be further from the truth. Oh, please. I hope tonight that I've been able to demonstrate that Carter's music is full of emotion. It's drama, wit, humor, passion, anger. Sometimes he writes furioso in the music, and yes, beauty. Now, sometimes I agree, so Carter sometimes uses complex techniques to accomplish his goals, but everything he does is for an expressive purpose. In 1976, he wrote an article called Music at the Time Screen. And I'll end by quoting part of the closing paragraph. He says, what is discussed here, and they were talking about technique, as should be obvious, but never seems to be, is the outer shell, the wrapping of the music, the reason for writing it, for developing it in the way described, for weighing every note, chord, rhythm in the light of their expressive intention and their living, spontaneous interrelationships, and the judging of it all almost unconsciously against a private standard of what gives me genuine sensuous pleasure, of what seems fascinating, interesting, imaginative, moving, and of urgent importance cannot be put into words. It is, I suppose, what is easily brushed off with words like involvement or commitment to music. Thank you for listening tonight. I hope it's been of interest.
All right, everyone, you can unmute yourselves and we can applaud. And I think there's a couple of minutes where we can have some quick questions before we need to break for the evening. So anyone want to start with a question?
I tried to get through it as quickly as I could.
Yes, well, this was, this was like 2 university lectures, but more entertaining and much faster. Okay, well, I'll ask the first quick question. You say that Carter is not a serial composer, and that's true, but he is borrowing some of the elements. And I was wondering, since you knew him personally, what did he think of the more strict serial composers?
Mm-hmm. He valued Schoenberg, the pieces that Schoenberg and the Second Viennese School wrote. He just didn't think that putting them in a specific order, using that as a system to generate your content made sense, because that isn't how we listen to music. When I'd ask him questions about people like Boulez, Babbitt, he had a lot of praise for Milton Babbitt. I think he valued what they were doing, but he didn't want to do it himself because he had good reasons not to write such a mechanical, systematic kind of music. As you can tell, he wanted to have far more intuitive control of the content. Somebody asked him at that USC session what he thought of Xenakis. I expected him to criticize it, and he said, "No, it's very interesting. It's very stimulating." He never would have done what Xenakis did, but it was interesting to him.
Other questions?
I have a quick question. What year did you say that he actually tabulated and printed out his book with all of his models in it?
It took him many, many years to compile. Over the 1970s, 1980s, by the time it was early 1990s, he had it. And it was published in 2002.
Interesting.
He never expected to publish it.
Sometime I would like to meet with you, Richard, and look at that book and compare it with a book that I have. It was a doctoral dissertation from 1958 or 1959 of the vector numbers of all the intervals of every scale, and it's a computer printout. Yeah. And I have used it as a source for a lot of, especially my early compositions, for a harmonic source. And it was very useful, but I got to the point where it was not so practical because of rehearsal times, and I've kind of not used it too much more recently. But anyway, I relate to so many things you were talking about, and I'd sure like to compare those two when we have a chance to get together.
Sure, we will.
Great. Okay, another quick question? Okay, great. Thank you all for your attention. I think this has been very informative, a lot of food for thought and things to listen to. Remember, we're going to have the talk coming up on, June 22nd, where we're going to talk about 7 eras in film music. And this is mostly going to be tonal music with lots of examples and intriguing personalities. And then on the 29th, we're going to have Jeannie Pohl's even more practical discussion of how to take advantage of the changes in the copyright law. So again, thank you all, and we've recorded this, so if you want to go back and listen to a section again, it'll be up within the week. So good night, and thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.